Today we are not talking about the worst. We are talking about the very best 4K horror movies that anybody can add to their collection, whether you're just starting out. I think these are just perfect movies to get into your collection, and whether you've been collecting for a very long time, like if you have these movies already and you're thinking about upgrading, now's the time. I think that these movies are, one, absolutely fantastic. They're enjoyable watches every single time I revisit them, but on the 4K format, these are the very best. Now, as we dive in, I want to let you know that I might have a steelbook or a premium edition set. Now, I'm not talking about that specific version. What I'm talking about is the 4K transfer. And so these, at the time of recording it, most of them are still available. But if they are not, the 4K transfers in different versions of this movie are still available. And so you can seek those out. The very first one here is Nightmare on Elm Street, the 4K version. Now, I did pick up the premium edition. This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the movie, not this specific version that I have. It's just a phenomenal picture, great sound, and this one had loads of special features, all kinds of commentary tracks and extra stuff there, deleted scenes, things I hadn't even seen before. But the really benefit of this is it did have a Dolby Atmos track, but it also had its original audio. And so if you'd like to appreciate it in that way, it did have that available for you. And so this one here is high on my list. We're going to knock it out at number one because I just watched it last night and I'm super excited about this one. Now, I didn't rank any of these, so they're not in any particular order, but I did want to talk about this one first. Now, if you've never seen Nightmare on Elm Street, it is a horror staple. It's something that I think everybody should watch at least once, but I think everybody should also own this movie. One of my all-time favorites. It's not my absolute favorite horror film of all time, but easily makes my top 5. And if for whatever chance you've never seen this one, Robert Englund stars as Freddy Krueger, who is the stuff of nightmares. He literally gets you in your dreams. And you have Heather Langenkamp, who is the final girl of this movie, and just top-notch. It's something I've been watching since I was a kid. And you also have a very first appearance of Johnny Depp in this film. And man, is that scene memorable where he meets Freddy. Everything about this film is just top notch. Number 2 is Poltergeist. Now, this one here comes up on the list. It is one of my favorites. At all time, it hits all of the things for me. I love this film, but I've never really kind of associated with horror. I am more now because everybody else does, and it just kind of gets reminded that, it's a horror movie. It's a ghost story. But growing up, ghost stories were never really in my wheelhouse of horror. I just enjoyed them. I thought they were great, probably because of Ghostbusters. I've mentioned it before, and then this movie has definitely come up on several lists, so I've had the same conversation, but this one here is just top notch. Absolutely love it. High recommend. I think everybody should own it. But this is a perfect 4K movie for me. Great picture, amazing sound. The restoration done on this is just top notch. For me, this is like easily a reference disc. If you've never seen Poltergeist, this came out in 1984. It's a Tobe Hooper direction. Steven Spielberg was attached to this project, and so you definitely have some Steven Spielberg vibes all over this film. And I think it just adds to the charm of this. And, the main character here, Craig T. Nelson, his family lives in a haunted house. There's a whole, new development, and he's part of, the group that's selling these homes, but he gets to live in one of them, and his house is sitting on an Indian burial ground, and ghosts show up. And this is just one of my all-time favorites. If you have this movie and you were on the fence about getting the 4K, if you're trying to get into 4K films, this one here is just a top-notch start to that collection. Really love this one. Now, this one here I just got. So the first Poltergeist I've been watching since it came out multiple times a year. Really enjoy it. Now, this one just came out. So I've only watched it like 2 or 3 times, and I hadn't seen it in pretty much probably over 20 years. And this is just another one. I think they did a superb job on the restoration. It's just a nice follow up to that original Poltergeist movie. And, a lot of times you have that rehashing, and, sequels don't usually kind of shake things up. And I thought this one did a nice job at mixing the two. And so you have the original family from the first one. They're still experiencing ghosts, even though they've moved, and that whole thing. And this is just, I thought it was a nice touch. Really enjoyed this film. And it's been such a long time since I've revisited this entire franchise. I really remembered the first two, but after that, I'm not really sure. I'm looking forward to them. I hope they knock all of them out and we get like a nice 4K box set eventually. But this 4K right here, 100% worth picking up. Now, number 4 is Scream. Now, this one here, again, I mentioned that this version might not be available to you when you might watch this, but the 4K transfer, this disc, this has the best possible picture. Really enjoyed this one. No flaws for me. I think it's just top notch. And as a movie, I love the Scream franchise, and so I love pretty much all of them. I'm not the biggest fan of the new ones, and I don't know if it's just me being an old man stuck in my ways and I like the originals, but they're kind of growing on me. But this one here, top notch, 100%. It's a must own for any horror fan. But if you're really trying to get into some horror and some really nice 4Ks to add to your collection, this is a great one to add. It has that 90s vibe, and for whatever reason, if you've never seen this film, just an all-time classic. Neve Campbell's in this one, Courtney Cox. This is just great. So you have, Skeet Ulrich is dating Neve Campbell, and some horrible things happen to her mother, and she's no longer with us, and, reliving that experience and that trauma. And then all of a sudden there's a killer chasing everybody, taking everybody out. And, it has a lot of those, like, kind of stereotypical jump scares, and just everything about a slasher film. For me, it works. I love this one. It's something I grew up watching, and I highly recommend this one. Now, this is one that came out and I slept on it for the longest time. Now, this one here, it was directed by Drew Goddard, and it came out in 2012. Now, in 2012, if you've been, following along with my journey at any point, and, you've probably heard before that I was in the Navy. In 2012 was probably the worst year for me because, when it comes to movies, because I was gone most of that year on deployment and different, underways. We were gone a lot. Pretty much the entire year I was home, maybe a couple weeks out of the entire thing before we were going out again. It was just something that my movie collecting kind of took a pause. Movies I saw that year kind of took a pause. But this one, we actually got it. Came out in 2012, and I don't know if it was like released on Blu-ray at that time or if it was just in theaters, but for whatever reason they sent it to the ship, and so we were able to watch this. But at the time I was eating, it was playing on the mess decks, and I saw kind of the ending, and it was really disappointing to me. And so I kind of just put it off, and everyone's like super excited about this film. They wouldn't stop talking about it, and it's Cabin in the Woods. Now, I slept on it for the longest time because of that reason, but I absolutely love it. I think it's just super fun. It adds like a really perfect blend of sci-fi to horror and, supernatural stuff. It's just all around. I think this is just a fun horror film to get into. And without giving any spoilers, you have these kids, they go to a cabin in the woods, and then horror starts to ensue. You have monsters and zombies and supernatural stuff going on. And there's also a twist at the end, and I don't want to give it away for anybody if you've never seen this one, but this one right here is absolutely a top-notch 4K, beautiful picture, and just a fun overall movie to get into, especially around the spooky season. Like, this is something that at the end of summer, coming into fall, I like to watch it. I think it's just a perfect go-to around that time, but one of my favorites, and I think everybody should own this film. The next one here from 1973, directed by William Friedkin, is The Exorcist. And now this one stars Linda Blair. Super awesome movie. Really enjoy this one. And it's something that it comes up on everyone's list of like top horror, top favorite. There are more people that love this film that don't love this film, and it gets talked about a lot. I don't think that I could honestly add anything to it other than the fact that I love the film. It's top notch. But this 4K here, 100% without a doubt, worth owning. If you're into horror, you're into that supernatural stuff, you're just trying to get into horror, this is one to start off with in that collection. Maybe it wouldn't be your first. I wouldn't recommend this as your first watch, maybe. But, you know, as you're starting to collect them in your first at least 10, get this one under your belt. But as far as collecting 4Ks, top notch, must own, great sound, great picture. I have said before, I don't love the artwork on this cover, and so there are different versions of this one available. But this version here we got in America, never been a big fan. The only plus and positive that I had to say about this cover was the fact that there was no big ugly banner out there saying that it had a 4K and a digital and a Blu-ray as well, and it just kind of led into what they decided to give us, even though I don't love that. But I do think that the green Exorcist on there, I think that just worked great. But other than that, this is a must own. I think everybody should have it. Really high on my list. Number 7 is an all-time favorite from 1987, and this has got a cast of characters that have just pretty much embodied the 80s. We're talking about both the Coreys. You have Kiefer Sutherland in this film. Just an absolute top-notch, one of my favorites, and we're talking about The Lost Boys. So this one here is a Joel Schumacher film, and you know, growing up, like the only time I really ever heard Joel Schumacher's name was when people were talking about Batman Returns and Batman Forever and whether they loved it or hated it, and Joel Schumacher did this to the film and that. So that's the only reason like his name even became like in my wheelhouse, and I even was familiar with him. I had seen this movie before I even saw those other movies, but I didn't realize that Joel Schumacher directed this. It wasn't until I became a little bit older and I started to really dive into film and my movie loving that I was like, hey, Joel Schumacher directed this one. So this is just an all-time classic. I think everybody should own it. It's got a little bit of campiness to it, but it's just a great vampire flick. So if you've never seen this one, it's just classic 80s and vampires rolled into one. And I think it just created a perfect storm of an enjoyable movie to watch. And this is something that I've been revisiting pretty much ever since I was a kid, but this 4K is absolutely top notch. One of my favorite versions of the movie, and I've had this on VHS before, and you know, I would rather watch this 4K than anything else. One of my all-time favorites, and I think everybody should own it. Now this is another one that if you have been going along this journey that I'm on for any length of time, you've probably heard this. This comes up on many of my lists. I love this film. I think it's underrated. I don't think anybody really talks about it, and maybe they do. Maybe I just completely have missed out on this one. But as I've been talking about it, every now and again, somebody's like, hey, yeah, that's a great movie. And I get these comments, and I just think it's great because I think that I'm over talking it and thinking it's a great film, but it definitely had to make this list. I couldn't leave it off, even though I know I've talked about it a lot recently. We're talking about Summer of '84. I think this is an amazing 4K. You can't go wrong with it. You know, and just a real quick, if you've never seen this one, there's a serial killer about, there's kids in the 80s, and I think it embodies that entire 80s vibe perfectly, because a lot of times I feel that when they try to give you that member berry and go, hey, look, the 80s, and kind of get people into movies or TV shows, they overdo it. They pretty much like slam how the room looks now, how my room looks now with all the stuff and everything. You see that in these 80s movies and TV shows where like the rooms are filled with all this stuff. And they weren't. Even like the rich kids back in the day didn't have like rooms filled with all this stuff and the pop culture references. It wasn't really an 80s thing. It seems to be like a more of a now thing. So the fact that this, I think, did a great job at bringing back the 80s and kind of giving you that vibe. But these kids, they kind of are able to run amok around the neighborhood. And growing up in the 80s, I kind of remember being able to do that myself. But at the same time, there was a serial killer about. Everybody was kind of on edge about this one. And so then the kids try to figure it out, and this is a great twist and really enjoy this one. High recommend, but the 4K on it is perfect. Now number 9 is another one that I slept on. It came out in 2018, and it's something that At the time when it came out, it just didn't really appeal to me because when it comes to horror, I've always said before, I'm into horror comedies and slashers. I've got a few outliers, movies that I really enjoy, but this is something that it's not really in my wheelhouse usually, and because it's like it's monster horror and it has that kind of, well, it doesn't really have a kind of vibe. It really is just a monster story, but the horror elements in here I think are top notch. The 4K is perfect, and the surround soundtrack is absolutely amazing because of the gimmick that they did for this movie. And we're talking about A Quiet Place. Now, this one, if you haven't seen it, there's monsters, and if you make a noise, the monsters come and get you. Like, that's pretty much as simple as I can say it without spoiling anything. But I think that this movie is absolutely top notch. And if you're trying to get younger ones into horror, I think this one's a good place to start because it's not so bad. So like once you step out of those like super kid friendly horror movies like Ernest Scared Stupid and like things like that, this is just a nice step into it because my 7-year-old, she watched this for the very first time this year, and she also watched Chucky, and she loved both of those, but this is what kind of got her into more of that horror vibe. She absolutely loved this one. It's not too crazy on the gore, it's not too crazy on the, there's nothing really crazily inappropriate in this movie, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was all perfect. I think it's a perfect movie. Great picture, great sound, a huge high recommend, and just the fact that my youngest could enjoy it, it was another plus. Now here's one. This is something that it is my all-time favorite, and so that's why none of these are ranked, because this one's sitting at number 10, and this one came out in 1978, directed by John Carpenter, stars Jamie Lee Curtis, Halloween, Michael Myers. I don't think you can go wrong, but this 4K, it's one of my favorite ways to enjoy this movie. Now I have some DVDs and VHS, and I have some Blu-rays, but this is my absolutely favorite version to watch this. I watch it all the time. But if I'm in this room, I do have an old CRT television, so I will pop in the VHS every now and again. That's how much I love the film. But I think this 4K really just, it adds all of that creep and ambiance and everything. I don't know. Sometimes I prefer a fuzzy aesthetic or a lesser quality format. So having no problem popping an old horror movie in on the VHS and just really sitting back and getting that kind of, reminiscing when I was a kid watching these movies, and that's how I watched it. It has a vibe that you really can't match without experiencing it yourself. But this 4K here, top notch, 100%. And I don't know if it's because it's one of my favorite films, but this 4K is one I always go to, and it's my preferred version to watch it. If you've never seen this on 4K, you're missing out, I think. This is just, for me, superb. Number 11 is The Fog. This is one came out in 1980, and it's another one that I absolutely slept on. For years, I confused this movie with The Mist. I remember seeing those trailers, and I just wasn't really into that movie. And I know since then people have told me that I'm sleeping on it and I'm missing out, but this is something that I picked it up last year and absolutely loved it. This 4K here is perfect. I've never seen the movie other than this 4K, so I have nothing to really compare it to, but I do know that it looks absolutely amazing, and this would probably be considered a reference quality disc. Great sound, great picture, great cast. You got Janet Leigh, you got Jamie Lee Curtis, it's a great film. You can't go wrong, but this is just another Deborah Hill, John Carpenter deal, and something that as a big John Carpenter fan, I don't know how I missed this one for so long, but it's a high recommend. Definitely if you're trying to get into horror, just a really great story, and the 4K is perfect. Now, this is something that it was an absolute day one purchase for me, something I've been watching for a very long time. It came out in the 70s, and I know a lot of people aren't 70s cinema fans, and I kind of am. But when it comes to 70s horror and those outliers, like, I know lots of people talk about Jaws. And so, like, that one came out in the 70s. The first Star Wars came out in the 70s. So there are some 70s movies that people absolutely love, no doubt. But I like a lot of 70s films. This is something I actually sought out as a kid, and I had to watch it, and it's Alien. Absolutely love it. But this 4K blew me away. The colors, the clarity, like everything, like really just made my television sing. Just a top-notch film. And if for whatever reason you've never seen this film, I highly recommend it. And now, because it has that sci-fi space horror elements, I know this doesn't come up on people's horror list all the time, but 100% without a doubt it's a horror. For me, it's a must-watch on a yearly basis. Absolutely love revisiting this one. But this is a perfect reference 4K disc, and something if you just want to show off your system, the way to go. Number 13 is Piranha. This one came out in 1978. It's a spoof on Jaws, which is probably why I like it a little bit more. But you have Barbara Steele, Dick Miller, directed by Joe Dante. This is just an all-around great film. And, it has that horror comedy, a little bit more darker horror comedy. And as the franchise goes on, the more movies they've made, they get a little more raunchy and more funny. And I do enjoy those a lot more. But this one here is top notch. I think it's a beautiful 4K and a fun movie to add to your collection if you're just trying to get into horror. High recommend. Absolutely love this film. But if you've never seen it, there's a situation that happens and a whole bunch of man-eating piranha get leaked in a lake and a river, and people just start getting eaten. It's a little ridiculous, a little convoluted. But I think that's the point. It was a spoof on Jaws. And so this is one of my all-time favorites. Roger Corman was involved in this one, and I just absolutely love that movie poster. All-time favorite. And this is something, as, I do watch movies all the time and I collect movies, but I do collect the memorabilia as well. And so an original Piranha movie poster is something I've been trying to add to my collection for such a long time. Even before I saw the movie, I was in love with this movie poster. So this is something high recommend, and I think the 4K is perfect. Now, this is a movie that came out in the 90s. I grew up watching this one, and it's about that time when horror kind of shifted. And so in the 80s and in the late 70s, you had a lot of the horror slasher type movies that were, they had the gratuitous nudity, and they just, the kill count would go higher and higher and higher every single time. But the 90s kind of tipped that on its head. So you went into that more of the PG-13 horror, and there was pretty much like no nudity. But at that time, I didn't really care and notice. I kind of did. Being a teenager, 13-year-old boy, I was like, where's the nudity? I definitely was there. So don't get me wrong. But this is what I grew up with, and I love it. And revisiting it every single year, it's really enjoyable. So number 14 is I Know What You Did Last Summer. Now, there's a little bit of a cheat here because I got the sequel in there. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. I count it as one because I can't watch one without the other. The 4K on both of these are just absolutely amazing. Absolutely love them. But this is the one that I always just get excited to watch and pop in. I don't know if it was just like the spooky vibe, the atmosphere that it created being on the island and all the rain, but since I can't watch one without the other, I always watch I Know What You Did Last Summer first, and then this one right afterwards at the beginning of summer, and then at the end of summer. I think this is a perfect movie for that going into the fall, so I watch them again. So I usually watch these about twice a year, both in the summertime, and I think they're just top-notch must-owns, perfect 90s slasher horrors. They look great on 4K. Now, 15 is something that is great. Makes a lot of my list as well. So if you've been following along, you've probably seen this one talked about quite a few times, and it is Return of the Living Dead. I know that a lot of people even talk about this one, but when I was younger, I don't recall anybody talking about this one. I first found it on a Saturday afternoon, and it kind of kicked off that whole Saturday afternoon thing for me. It's something I talk about all the time. Saturday afternoons had these like certain types of movies that most people weren't really talking about anymore, and it was a place to find hidden gems. Usually found them just flipping the channels on cable, and then any given Saturday afternoon you could find something worth watching, and that was how I first found Return of the Living Dead. Just an absolute all-time classic, but this 4K is amazing. I think it's top notch. Another reference disc, I think, one of my favorites and a high recommend. Now on to the bonus movies. Now these ones here, I think they're 100% top notch, and that's not why they're bonus. They're bonus because I love them, and I think they're high recommends and must owns, but not everybody has that kind of same feel. And the reason is because the way the film was shot or the age of the film. I know that the average person kind of puts these films off. And so the very first one here is Psycho. Now the 4K on this, and on most of the 4Ks for the older films, especially the black and white, are absolutely amazing. I have not had a single black and white film that was restored and put on 4K that didn't look amazing. So this 4K here, now I have the Steelbook. I do also have a UK import of this movie. And so this version here might not be available at the time, but the 4K inside will be. And so I just have a different package. But this is something that I highly recommend. Absolutely love it. And I think it's just a great film, especially if you're just starting to get into horror. So if it's something for whatever reason you've never seen it, it's just a good one to start off with. Now the next one here, it's on this list because I think the 4K is amazing. The colors are awesome. There's stuff about this film that is perfect. But I also understand that while, not every movie is for everybody, there is a movie for you. And this movie fits that category perfectly. Like the other films in this list, it doesn't have this like cohesive story from beginning to end. And so this one here is something that I love it, but it is weird and wild and doesn't make sense. But the 4K is 100% worth owning. It is a perfect film when it comes to that. Great picture, great sound, and it embodies that entire 70s creepy horror style. And we're talking about Dario Argento's Suspiria. Now, this is something that I love the film, like I said, but it's weird, and I do know that. And so, like, if you've ever seen Mulholland Drive, and I always compare it to that film just kind of doesn't make sense, but people love it anyway. This is the same thing. It's just creepy and weird and has that vibe. And, for everything that it has going for it, it has a lot of stuff that people can just pick apart very easily. But if you absolutely love this film, I'm not knocking it in any way. Like I said, I do love it. But this is also something I know that it's not for everybody, which is why it was a bonus. But I think this is a top-notch 4K, clearly a reference disc, and a great reference for movies that have been restored and put on 4K and what they could look like being an older film. That was 15 perfect 4K horror movies to start your collection with 2 bonuses. Let me know in the comments down below if my list matches yours, or if there's something that you would add, something I didn't have on this list that you highly recommend that I check out. You can also always follow me on social media. I do have Twitter and Instagram. Those links are down below, and you can get in touch with me a little bit more that way, or we can connect a little differently on those platforms as we can right here on YouTube. And I want to give a big shout out to the newest channel member, Bill Sample. I appreciate you and all of the channel members. Thank you for everything that you do. Check out this video right here for some more movie recommendations. With that, watch a movie today, and I'll catch you guys next time.